David, you're going to have to give me the time because I'm all fired up after Maduri and Yahya were speaking. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the criminalization of immigration is, just from a partial legal perspective. And I will try to not make this for lawyers only, because then everybody will run screaming from the room. But as Maduri mentioned earlier, we have an immigration system that is essentially a civil system. Civil in the sense of not being criminal, not necessarily in terms of being just and humane. And in a civil system, and especially in this civil system, there are certain hallmarks that are really important. One is that your rights in a civil context are a little bit less strong than they would be in a criminal context, because when you're detained in immigration detention, from a legal perspective, you're not being detained for punitive purposes to punish you for something that you've done. You're being detained in order to process whether you are here in the country legally or not, and to facilitate deportation if it looks like you're a flight risk or not. The important thing to realize is that in the immigration context, the hammer, the real power, comes at the back end of that system. It's the deportation, the removal power that the federal government has. In the criminal system, it's a little bit different. In the criminal system, you have a right to a lawyer if you're charged with a felony or misdemeanor. You do not have a right to a lawyer in an immigration context, by the way. The power in the criminal system happens a lot in the front end. So, for example, if you're walking down the street and the police officer has a reasonable cause to believe that you've committed a crime, you can be stopped and detained and questioned. And then if he or she feels that there's more there and there's more evidence, you can be detained and arrested and then put before a criminal process. But that is a tremendous power that the police have in the front end of the system. And the only thing that protects us from being randomly detained for no reason or at the whim of a mean or evil or just a stupid police officer is our due process rights and our rights under the 14th Amendment if we are people of color, for example, or for other reasons. Now, the criminalization of immigration is the merging of those two systems. And what it does is it takes the worst aspects of each and combines them to completely disempower the person who was being detained. So, for example, the criminal aspects, and the Arizona SB 1070 law is a classic example of this. And it is, and I also want to throw out, and I think people here would agree with me, that while it is certainly the most current and certainly the most egregious state law that we're looking at right now, it is by far not an anomaly. This is not an isolated incident that once this case is over in Arizona, that we can wash our hands and we don't have to worry about it. But here's a little bit how it works. In SB 1070, as you know, it mandates police officers to ask people for their papers. It literally, it's the Gestapo law, right? Show me your papers. What's interesting about it is, and problematic, is that it combines the criminal law with that aspect of immigration law so that you can be stopped for having an overgrown law, for whatever is a summonsable offense, for jaywalking, for public intoxication, for carrying an open beer can, for riding on the wrong side in the wrong lane. Like the things that people around here do, and that certainly are not criminal offenses that rise to the level of making anybody scared for their lives, but these can be the pretext through which a stop that a police officer can then demand your papers. The other part of why this is really problematic is then once you are detained, and while you, in the criminal context, and while you normally would have the due process rights of the criminal context, you then are denied the ability to essentially challenge your information being sent over to the immigration authorities. And so what that means practically is if you just had a criminal case and you got arrested for a bullshit reason, you would have access to a lawyer, you would be able to argue that this is not true, this is bullshit, and the judge would dismiss your case. In this SB 1070, by the time you don't even get to a courtroom before the government has passed on this information to the immigration authorities. So even if your case is kicked because it's cracked, you are still then in the database, and you can very easily be turned over to the immigration detention system, and that's where the deep end of that system is. They've got you, and it is essentially a way of disappearing people for no reason at all. So that's essentially what we are all here to talk about. And I just want to echo a couple of things that were brought up that I think are very important. One, an issue that Maduri brought up was that, while this stems back from 1996 under the Clinton administration with a law called IRA, that we've seen the explosion of these types of sentiments since September 11th.